Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray,
And I'm Chris.
and today we have a very special episode for our listeners, one that we've had on the books for some time, and we're very excited to bring it to you. And that is, we're going to be talking to Dr. Denver Brunsman, who is Department Chair for History and an Associate Professor of History at the George Washington University in DC. And Chris, when I think back on the interview that we had Dr. Brunsman in, it was just, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I thought it was a great opportunity for us to discuss two things that we really love. And that one is kind of the founding era of our country and kind of how it came to be, and the many different things that the founding fathers and mothers, if you will, that they wrestled with, the tensions that they faced, and also kind of looking at how that has formed government as we know it today. And, our real focus on this podcast was the executive power and how it came to be, and some of the difficulties that Washington saw with it, and some of the ways that he tried to navigate some very difficult moments in American history with great leadership, with a strong sense of purpose, and with a keen eye on ensuring that there would be a republic, which is something that we talked about. And I think our listeners will find some really interesting insight from him that speak to some of the things that maybe we knew, but we didn't know in great detail, that might open our eyes to how things are playing out today.
Yeah, it was certainly a very good interview. It's not often you get to sit down with a scholar and have a one-on-one conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, well, I kind of take offense to that. I think you and I do it every time we get together with our podcast. But, it was great having a real scholar with us, right?
It was. So I think our listeners are going to enjoy this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. So without further ado, Chris, let's go into the interview with Dr. Denver Brunsman. Okay, so today we're joined by Dr. Denver Brunsman from the George Washington University. Dr. Brunsman is chair of the history department there at George Washington and a leading scholar on early American history. And today we'll be talking with Dr. Brunsman about George Washington and his use of executive power, how he viewed the president, what precedents he set as president of the United States. So we're looking forward to a great conversation, Dr. Brunsman.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I think I'll just go ahead and get things started. So what, sort of starting with the basics here, what sparked your interest in history and specifically your interest in George Washington?
Yeah, great question. History, I grew up in the West. I grew up in Salt Lake City. My mother was a high school English teacher, and my father was a journalist. He wrote for the Salt Lake Tribune, and I think those influences seeped into me. I was interested in politics from an early age. And I had some great teachers. And one of the things that I was assigned in high school was the musical 1776.
Mhm.
We read it, and of course Washington doesn't have a great role in that. We just get him through his correspondence. We don't actually see him, but I think that was the moment where I got hooked, and one thing led to another, and I kind of keep doing this, and you get a little bit better at it, and fortunately, people kept asking me to do it. So, so it's been fun to see over the past current generation, the Hamilton craze, and to see young people get excited through kind of a similar way as I did.
Yeah, uh, the Hamilton play was something that I saw in my class. I didn't see it, but I mean, I saw in students in my classroom starting around 2018, 2019, and how much I had one young lady in my class, and I mean, I think she knew Hamilton about as good as anybody. I mean, she
Yeah,
stuck with the play and went from there.
yeah, yeah. And as educators, and you guys appreciate this, I think it's useful for young people to have a base of something. They're coming in, even if it's not completely correct, because you can teach against that.
Mhm.
But I think it's good to have some frame of reference and some spark, right? Something that they're excited about.
I think it's interesting you speak about Washington and trying to get to understand him. There is this mythic image of Washington that has been portrayed throughout as the years have gone on. So how do you balance that mythic image with the reality that he was a very complex man with a lot of very difficult problems that he had to experience that you have found through your research? So looking at past, but also the present interest in history through Hamilton, 1776, a lot of other things. How do you balance that to get all individuals today to really say, wow, I want to dig into this further?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm very lucky where I'm located that I'm able to teach a class about George Washington that actually takes place at Mount Vernon. I take the students there once a week, and we have nearly 3 hours to explore different aspects of Washington's life. And so, one thing that I've done, and I really appreciate what you said about kind of thinking about the representation and the memory and how that can kind of get in the way of the reality and the actual person, is I teach both, and I increasingly look at legacy and memory and find that actually quite interesting. And so, is one thing I have my students do, first of all, to get at the actual person, we plow through as many primary sources as possible. It helps to be at that site because that really does humanize Washington. You see where he lived and walked. I think that means a lot. But then I think it's important to stress that we do deal with a lot of memory and representation, and to make that a subject of study as well. And I've taught this class. This is the 14th year. I'm going to I'll have a book come out with the same name of the class, George Washington and His World. And I think it's kind of like a vain hope that, kind of like Pirates of the Caribbean began as a ride and then became a movie that somehow this will become a franchise of some sort for me. But when I first started teaching it, I didn't focus as much on the memory and the legacy. And I've come to, over time, I've come to appreciate how critical that is, because that's the filter. That's kind of what we get as as people in 2025 or 2026 with the 250th anniversary.
Yeah.
So, what would you find to be with this? Maybe what's the most misunderstood aspect of who Washington was, maybe his presidency that you've kind of discovered?
Yeah, excellent question. So I mean, there's a couple of different things I'm happy to talk about, but just on the topic that we're focused on today, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding with his use of executive power. I think he was quite scrupulous in his exercise of power, but that doesn't mean that he didn't fully use the power he had. So one thing that I've been interested in getting back to legacy is the imperial presidency. What scholars have used that term to describe the presidency stemming from after World War II, World War II era, really to the present. And I ask a question in some of my work, and that is, how much is George Washington responsible for this phenomenon of this very strong executive that we have in the United States? And I have a little bit of a wishy-washy answer, but and that is, I think he does bear some responsibility. I think as the person most responsible in creating this office, I don't think he himself in any way wanted to or actually really did overstep constitutional bounds. But just the nature of the office, I think, certainly leaves open that possibility, and the fact that he did create a very strong precedent for the office.
Yeah, and sort of going back in his life a little bit, what do you think the influence of his time as commander of the army, what influence did that have on how he viewed the presidency when he came into it?
I think his time as the commander of the American forces in the Revolutionary War was just crucial. I mean, I think first of all, he almost was the president of the country in a sense. One thing I have to stress to students and in the general public and talks is that he wasn't just a general. that there was only two national institutions in the country at the time. There's Congress and there's the Continental Army. And so he's almost like, an executive department unto himself at that time. And experienced firsthand the difficulties of having a weak central government, central government that couldn't raise revenue, that couldn't easily support his army. And so, there's been some pretty good studies on this, but most of the sort of future Federalist Party members, those people that really supported a strong central government, they come from they had some experience in the army because they experienced it firsthand, and to a lesser extent some that had been in Congress, but those who were for more state power and more of a decentralized government system, they were usually in the states during the Revolutionary War, so they might have served in the state legislatures or state militias. Patrick Henry is a great example of this, kind of a classic example that he was really, really connected to the state, experience in the revolution. So it's kind of interesting to see how people went different ways based on that experience in the revolution.
Yeah, and his time as commander also, I know, sort of influenced his decision to move his once he was in the presidency to move his department heads into more of a cabinet.
Yeah, yeah. I think that the best work we have right now on the origin of the cabinet, which is by Lindsay Stravinsky,
Yep.
who's currently the executive director of the Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. Her book on the cabinet, I think, is very persuasive. That his war councils become really kind of the template, the model for the cabinet. And even though there was kind of a notion of a cabinet in the British experience, it was different, in the parliamentary system than in our Republican system, the way that it's set out. So yeah, I think those things carry over, and you could also say, his experience running Mount Vernon, and that
Yeah.
was very much an executive
Yeah.
position. That if you count all the enslaved workers and hired workers and everybody else that he's is in essence managing or supervising there, it was on any given day more people than he was dealing with in the federal government,
Yeah.
and often even during the war. Yeah.
I think that makes it a very important point is we know that he was a strong leader. He had vision, he was visionary, he saw what needed to be done, but how did he balance that strong leadership with democratic restraint? And how can that be seen in today's society as a value that we can employ, in government, where you see where you want it to go, but you also know that there has to be some restraint along the way.
Yeah, I think what's really important in the revolutionary experience is they're hyper focused on the fact that this is a republic, right? That this is a government of representatives, that it's not a monarchy. And I think Washington was very cognizant of that. And we see that in different ways. One of my favorite ways to illustrate it with students and the general public is that we have Washington's copy of the Constitution. And when I say we, I mean Mount Vernon does.
Yeah.
Uh, that he actually marked in different parts he wrote, powers required or president at different points. And to me, that's the definition of constitutional government, that he's saying, I do these things, but I don't do all those other things. And so by, when I said that he's in a sense pushing the limits of his own power, that's true, but within what was constitutionally warranted. He's not, he's very careful to not overstep into the other branches of government. And I guess maybe the difference for us right now, a couple hundred years down the road, is that in our own politics, I sense and see a very maximalist kind of approach to these different things, that we're going to push everything as far as possible in order to for partisan advantage, and
Mhm.
that was just not part of Washington's makeup or sensibility.
Yeah, yeah. He was somebody who understood the importance of restraint, but I think he also understood the importance of precedent, and he understood that people were going to be looking back to him 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road.
Yeah, yeah. And he says that in his words, one of the real famous letter that he writes in January 1790 to the British historian Catherine Macaulay Graham. He says, I walk on untrodden ground. That, just about everything I do is gonna be a precedent. And yeah, he does that. And I think each of his decisions, that's kind of in the back of his mind. And we're lucky that that was the case.
Yeah. And one of the things that, with that in mind, and you were talking about how he didn't, or he worked not to sort of step on the powers of Congress, et cetera, it was after the Jay Treaty, if I'm remembering correctly, the House wanted the documents that had been used to negotiate the treaty, and the Washington administration was sort of like, no, that's between us and the Senate. So he's sort of going back to the Constitution, going the Senate advises in and advice and consent, not the House there on the treaties.
Yeah, this is a great example, and it's a great way to kind of show Washington's nuanced approach to power because he writes, I mean, it's kind of a bitter letter, but it's also a little bit funny, writing to the House because he says, I was there. I was
Mhm.
there when we when we crafted the Constitution, and I know for a fact that the House doesn't have any role in
Mhm.
treaties, right? And and in doing that, though, he actually exercises what we call today executive privilege, and
Mhm.
that's the first time. So that's one of these things that I find so fascinating, and that's kind of what I was getting at is that he in no way I think is trying to expand the powers of the presidency, but he does set this precedent that is going to expand
Mhm.
it a lot down the road, right? When other presidents cite executive privilege, but for him, it was very well meaning, and I think historians and constitutional scholars and lawyers, and they look at that example and they think he was absolutely correct that the House didn't have a right to all the paperwork of the negotiations of the Jay Treaty. Yeah,
Yeah, he was using executive power to, or executive privilege to sort of keep everything within the constitutional framework.
that's right. Yeah, it's something of a constitutional innovation
Hmm.
for constitutional purposes. Yeah.
Yeah.
He spoke very strongly against about the dangers of partisanship. How would he look at executive leadership and executive privilege, power like that today with the strong amount of partisanship that is found in society?
With dismay, I think it's fair to say that another thing that I'm a little bit counter in some ways in some of my work, and I do think Washington was more partisan perhaps than we fully recognize or appreciate. But that doesn't mean that his ideal I think was to be nonpartisan. That was his ideal, and a word that he uses constantly uh, is disinterested and disinterestedness. And when we hear that today, it basically means that somebody's not interested, right? They don't care. But in the 18th century, it had a very specific meaning that someone was seeking the common good, and it was the opposite of self-interest. So the problem with political parties in his mind is that they weren't disinterested; they were self-interested. Parties were in it for themselves, and so I think he really did try to avoid that. And in some ways, I think maybe the mistake of the founding era, if we want to go back and look at some of the choices that were made, is they were a bit naive to not bake political parties into the system, right? There's no thought about parties in the Constitution, no real reference to them. We have a winner take all system really by default. It was never really planned so much. And so they were, in some ways, they were like the general focused on the last war, in trying to separate the power, separate the different branches, which of course is important. But they were so focused on separating the different branches that they didn't really conceive of the possibility that there could be a partisan or a side, a faction, a party that could actually capture all of the
Mhm.
branches. And how do you deal with that kind of situation? And that's something that our Constitution maybe doesn't really have a remedy for.
Yeah, and we really see that in the current political environment where you have one party that does have control of both the executive and legislative branches, and it sort of leaves the other party out in the cold, even when the party with the majority is a very small majority.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's a lot of things about a parliamentary system I wouldn't want to replicate, but I do appreciate the fact that there is some reward for different political parties, and that there's been important third party movements in the United States, but they've been limited because in the end, there's really nothing to gain from from a third party, right? You get
Yeah.
nothing, literally nothing, without winning. Whereas in a parliamentary system, you would get some kind of percentage of seats or power. So it it has had this effect, I think, for us today to really kind of stagnate our politics to an extent. And I think something really dramatic would have to happen for us to fall out of our current two-party system that we've had for so long.
Yeah, and even with George Washington, when you talked about how he was to some degree partisan, he certainly during his administration and even afterwards, he certainly was more on the Alexander Hamilton side of the debate than the Thomas Jefferson side of the debate. And I know that that caused Jefferson endless amounts of headaches.
It did, and drove him crazy.
Mhm.
And to the extent that he almost didn't want to believe that Washington came to these views independently. He's always kind of looking for a conspiracy of some sort that or some other explanation. And so, he starts with the fact that Hamilton is basically kind of corrupted Washington, that Hamilton's, got his ear. And going
Mhm.
back to the musical, there's a great song or phrase that it's nice to have Washington on your side. And Hamilton certainly did. And then as Washington progresses in his presidency, the explanation that Jefferson comes up with is that he's becoming senile, that he's becoming an old man, and he doesn't even know what he's doing, right? And I think what we look at it now, I think there's much more of an appreciation that Washington actually just shared the same
Yeah.
ideology as Hamilton. I mean, that's the thing, and that's why I say he was a bit more partisan. His views align like very much with the Federalist platform, if so to speak. Didn't diverge from it very much. And yeah, again, I think for Jefferson, and maybe it was a regional thing, for Jefferson and Madison, the fact that their fellow Virginian seemed to be betraying the region and the region's economy in a lot of different ways.
One of the things that I'd like to go back to, you mentioned you have a new book that's coming out. And one of the questions I'm sure that students and others of history would ask is, how do you keep finding information about Washington and of the founding era? How do you keep going? Because you would think, okay, everything's been said about, Washington, but then there's this new take on it. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your book, but also kind of what drew you into saying, okay, here's the direction I'd like to go with this.
Yeah, it's a great question. When I started teaching the class on George Washington at Mount Vernon, I had friends in the profession that wrote to me and said to me, "Boy, this sounds terrible. You're gonna have to teach this class every year. It's gonna get really boring. What more can you say about George Washington?" And I found, the exact opposite. And part of it has to do with the fact that his papers are so voluminous that his papers project, which is headquartered at UVA and has a little branch at Mount Vernon, they've been at work since the 1960s. and they're still going at it, and they're still, they still haven't finished the Revolutionary War. They started at different points in Washington's life, so his retirement's been long done in the colonial period and things. But the presidency is just finishing up, and the Rev War is going to be a little bit longer. So that, so there actually is new information that comes out. The other area where there's new information is archaeology and that material culture and material side of things at Mount Vernon. Just this past summer, through the work that's being done there, really in anticipation of the 250th, they're trying to get the mansion, as nice and sparkling as they can. They discovered that there's almost certainly an enslaved family that lived in the basement of the mansion, and up to this point, this has never been known that there was actually enslaved people that lived in the mansion itself, albeit the basement. So there is continually, new information, and I guess this is the last thing I would say, and this kind of gets at what maybe I tried to accomplish in my book, is that Washington's been written about a lot, but a very large percentage of that is the exact same thing over and over and over again. Yeah. And that didn't interest me. I didn't want to do that because as an academic scholar, you want to, the phrase we use going back to graduate school is we want to create new knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. Sounds like we're making something up, but I did want to bring new things to the fore. And because of that, the book it's not a strict biography. It's organized by topics, and part of the goal of each chapter is to kind of give a state of the field of what we know about, there's something on slavery, there's George Washington's relations with Native Americans in the West, there's the presidency, the Revolution, Enlightenment is I think an important theme in Washington's life. And then getting at what I was talking about earlier, legacy, I devote a chapter to that. And so I'm depending heavily on other scholars because it's a synthetic work, but there's also a lot of primary work in it as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm looking forward to it. When do you think we'll be able to get our hands on that?
Unfortunately, it's going to be a little while. I think
a little while yet.
It's slated for October 2026. So yeah, the way publishing works. Yeah, but yeah, I'm excited for it too. And I think if I would have been a little smarter, I would have had it done a little earlier and have it out at the beginning of the 250th. but I found that publishers want things, throughout the year, and so it will be part of that that important year, right? Yeah.
Very important year. Even around here, they're gearing up. The local town and the county and even the college to some degree is gearing up for the 250th. So it's going to be an exciting year. I know.
Yeah, and I think one thing that hopefully comes out of it, and that people will just see, is just how fascinating this event really is. That it's not easy to fully understand, that it's complicated, that there's been a lot of literature in the past generation on the Loyalists, and almost everything that's come out of for that literature is that the Loyalists love liberty just as much as the the Patriots. It's not like they hated liberty. They just saw different means to realize it. And and the majority of Native Americans, the majority of African Americans sided with the British and for reasons of liberty, or sovereignty in the case of Native Americans. And so it complicates it. And I think that can be healthy for us to see that that our founding was contested, that it wasn't a total no-brainer, and that can maybe help us to make things better today.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for taking a few minutes with us and really helping us to understand how studying history, and especially studying Washington's example, can help us in today's society be better prepared to understand and possibly some might even say protect the balance of power that exists in today's society. So I appreciate the few moments that you were able to spend to enlighten us and to help us to preserve the annals of history, but also to make history ourselves.
Yeah, no, it's been a great pleasure, and I appreciate what you're all doing to get history out into the public.
Okay, Chris, there we go. Our interview with Dr. Denver Brunsman. Any closing comments that you want to share with our listeners?
I really think that, this just reminds us, especially when we were talking about with Dr. Brunsman, how do we keep finding out new things and new topics? And one of the things that he basically states is just the amount of material that is still left to uncover. I thought the concept about the archaeological dig, where they're just now finding out that there were enslaved that were living in the basement, that is something totally new. Also, that the letters and the correspondence and the writings, they're just now getting into some of the Revolutionary War. History is ever moving. It is always there. There's always something to learn, and 2 + 2 will always be 4 in a math world. But when it comes to history, you always get to see someone or something in a whole different light. And I think that is something that our students can learn from it, that we as just ordinary average Americans need to pay attention to, that when events happen, we need to think through them. We need to reason about them and to have an understanding that everyone's entitled to an opinion, but we all need to have one.
Yeah, and history is the one field that if you say you teach history or you work in history, someone's inevitably going to say something along the lines of, "Well, that must be easy because history never changes." And I think what Dr. Brunsman did so well, among other things, is like you said, discussing the fact that history indeed changes all the time. Not that what happens changes. What happened happened. It is what it is. But our understanding of what happened changes as more information comes out, whether it's in the form of letters, journals, archaeological evidence, or whatever it may be. Information that comes out, history does change. So history is one of those fields that, like any other field there is, whether you're talking about biology, chemistry, or whatever, new discoveries are being made, and it sounds like new discoveries are being made at Mount Vernon, even as we recorded this episode, and that's very exciting to me.
Yeah, and I just want to encourage our listeners. One of the things that I've always been intimidated by scholars and historians. And I just really thank Dr. Brunsman, because he made you feel like you were just having a coffee conversation, and it was very relaxing and it was very enjoyable. And that's kind of how his articles and his books are, that they're very engaging, they're open to anyone. And I encourage our listeners to go and check out some of the other books that he has written. He has some great material that is out there. He mentioned a little bit about the book that will be coming out next year, but he's also just written quite a few other things, and I just encourage them to go and take a look and not be intimidated by reaching out and listening to individuals like Dr. Brunsman and other scholars about particular matters, because they do open our eyes to a whole new world. And he did that with me in this podcast.
Yeah, and also I would encourage our listeners, if they want to take his self-paced class, George Washington and His World, you can go to the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, and you can sign up there just to do the lectures with quizzes. It's not the full class, but it is you go through the lectures and you take the quizzes. If you're wanting to know more about George Washington from Dr. Brunsman, that is an excellent opportunity to sit under his teaching. So, Chris, thank you for helping with this project. I think it was a very good interview, and I look forward to more interviews in the future, maybe, and certainly more episodes as we continue to dig into history you didn't know but should. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.